Hello, everyone, and welcome back to War and Literature, English 1120. I'm Tim Wilson, if you're just joining in. And tonight we have our third of 4 lectures on Virgil's Aeneid. So in the first lecture, we looked at the background of Aeneas, what we know about Aeneas from the Iliad, and what we know about Virgil, the author. Then we looked in the second lecture at the cultural background, the Romans' borrowing of Greek culture and their foundation myths. And we also looked at the historical background. We looked at, in particular, really the formation of the Roman Republic and their burgeoning world power after their wars with Carthage, the Punic Wars. And we talked about how Carthage and the fate of Carthage are in a lot of ways in the background of the epic. We also talked a bit about the civil wars that had been going on for about 100 years as also in the background of the epic. So tonight we're going to get into the work as such. We're going to look at books 1 and 2. And in the last lecture, the Wednesday lecture, we'll look at books 4 and 8, which I also asked you to read. Before we get into the lecture per se, I want to remind everyone that assignment number 2 is due this Friday, February the 18th. So 5 p.m., have your 100 to 150 word reflection on Virgil's Aeneid posted on the discussion forum on Brightspace, please. And as with last time, the grading is pretty simple. If you do it, you get full marks. If you don't, you don't. So you get 0. So don't, well, make sure you do it. Make sure you do it. And as last time, put in some thoughtfulness and put in some time into thinking about what's your takeaway from the work. What are some of the main points that you think you'll take away from the work, and what immediately struck you about the work upon reading it, and maybe our discussions in class as well. So with that, let's get started. I will, as always, share my screen here so that you can follow along in terms of the points I'm making. And we are going to start with book 1, as I mentioned, and I think we should have plenty of time to go through book 1 and book 2 in terms of our discussion today. And in terms of the opening is really important, just like the Iliad. So we really pay close attention to that. And Virgil's opening makes very clear right from the beginning his debt to Homer and how in some ways he's rewriting Homer. So the first words of the epic are in Latin. It's written in Latin, arma virumque cano. So I sing of arms and a man. So they recalls both of Homer's epics. It recalls both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the first word of the Iliad is rage or wrath, mainen, and it's the subject is war or arms, right? And the first word here is arma, so or of arms. And the first word of the Odyssey is man, andra, and the subject is the adventures of one person, one man. And here it's again our arma and virumque. So virumque is and of a man, and cano is the I sing part. So the first 2 words have to do with the first 2 words of each of the Homeric epics quite explicitly. And the Aeneid's larger goal is stressed from the very beginning as well. So Aeneas is fated to found the Roman people, and the epic is as much about the inevitability of Rome as it is about Aeneas. So it tries to go beyond, I guess you could say, the Homeric epics in terms of talking about the heroism of one individual and showing how that one individual is connected to the fate of the entire people. Aeneas's fate is constantly and consistently pictured as leading to the founding of Rome. So in seeing this individual, we're seeing the playing out of the history and the fate of the greater Roman society. I'll just go over quickly what we see in the first book. We're quickly introduced to some of the major characters, both gods and individual human characters. So first of all, we see Juno, and so we see that Juno's implacably angry at the Trojans for several reasons, and the epic explicates why. So first of all, over the judgment of Paris. Now, we've mentioned this a couple of times in the background lectures to the Aeneid, but also in our lectures on the Iliad. Juno is also angry with the Trojans over the founder of Troy, Dardanus, who was an illegitimate son of Jupiter. So Jupiter always getting into trouble with his extramarital affairs, especially ones involving humans and their offspring. Over Ganymede, the Trojan prince abducted by Jupiter to be Jupiter's paramour, another kind of love interest, and over the fate of Carthage. So Carthage is a favorite city of Juno's, and she knows that Carthage is fated to be destroyed at the hands of the Romans, and again, she holds that against the Trojans, who would go on to found Rome, according to this foundation myth. The character of Venus is introduced in the first book. She's concerned for her son Aeneas and tries to help him by appealing to Jupiter through and by direct interaction with Aeneas and by manipulating Dido. She reminds Jupiter that Jupiter has promised that the Romans will rule both land and sea, and she's concerned by the fact that Juno seems to be trying to thwart these plans by whipping up a storm, which disperses the ships and causes them to crash on the African shore rather than being able to make it to Italy. She then appears in disguise to Aeneas shortly after he's made landfall in Africa and tells him to seek help from Dido, the queen of Carthage, and informs him that 12 of his ships survived the storm and only one was lost. He had thought that they all were lost. And she later manipulates Dido by forcing her to fall in love with Aeneas. So Jupiter's response to Venus's appeals is it establishes him as, in some sense, the arbiter of fate, and reasserts the inevitability of Rome's power. So he reconfirms the fact that Rome is destined to be, so to speak. The way he talks in book one, basically, it seems as though what fate and what he decrees are one and the same thing. So fatum is that which is spoken or decreed in Latin. So fate is really tied to that which is spoken, that which has been decreed. And in a way, it's almost as though Jupiter is the one decreeing, but that's not entirely the case. Much as with the fates with fate in the Iliad, fate binds the gods as well, including Zeus, including Jupiter. He declares that he's given the Romans power without limit, imperium sine fine, and he prophesies the advent of a descendant of Venus who will bring power and peace to Rome. So a Trojan Caesar, and this probably is referring to Augustus. And remember, Augustus is the Caesar, the ruler at the time of Virgil's writing, and in some ways we could see the epic as a celebration of this rule, and Aeneas as this hero that kind of emulates the path of Augustus, or prefigures it in some way. This Caesar says Jupiter will shut unholy rage, or Furor impius, up in the closed gates of the Temple of War. So remember, Augustus had shut those the gates of Janus to symbolize peace after the long Roman civil wars. And this phrase, furor impius, so unholy rage or like literally impious madness, right? So it's as opposed to what Aeneas embodies piety, pietas, is that sense of duty to all to whom one has a duty, to family, to my fellow members of the community, to the gods. I'm always thinking about my duty to others if I'm pious, if I'm exemplifying this virtue of piety or pietas. So madness, in a way, it causes one to forget one's duties. It's madness, passion, rage, all these things, whether it's passion, the passion of love, or the passion of vengefulness. So one's so consumed by that. One's consumed by kind of an insane rage or madness that causes one to forget one's higher purpose and calling. Okay, so we need to keep in mind how this will be opposed throughout the epic to the mission of Aeneas. So Aeneas' mission, the mission of Rome, is only to be achieved through this virtue of piety, but it needs to happen in contradistinction to and overcome, in a way, this unholy rage or this impious furor. And in some ways, it's inextricably linked. As we mentioned when we were talking about the foundation myths, Rome is constantly, well, reminds itself of its violent beginnings. It has violent beginnings, and the violent beginnings are echoed in this epic. I remember I mentioned that the last action for Aeneas is the killing of Turnus, and so he kills Turnus. It's the last image we have of the epic. It's the last image of Aeneas that we have, and we're reminded that the greatness that is Rome can only be achieved through also this kind of furor impius. So there is a rage inextricably bound to the piety, and it's difficult to separate them as much as Aeneas tries to, as Virgil tries to, as the Roman Republic tries to. In his first speech, I think I mentioned last time about the first two speeches. Pay close attention to those in book one, the first two speeches of Aeneas. And there's a storm sent by Juno, and in the midst of this storm, it looks like all's lost, and he's in a moment of despair, and he's speaking as a private individual to himself, so to speak. And it alludes to a similar speech. It's very similar to a speech spoken by Odysseus, who's alone and wrecked at sea. And in this speech, Aeneas is anguished and longing for home, and he's despairing his plight, and he's saying, it would have been far better to have died in Troy than be where he is. And then the second speech is delivered to his comrades after the storm has scattered the fleet, and he's trying to rally them, so to speak. They assume that their other 13 ships are lost, and he needs to encourage and hearten his men and remind them of their destiny, remind them of their duty. And that's a far different speech, and we'll kind of look at them in a second. So in comparing the two speeches, we're reminded of the private and the public sides of Aeneas, okay? We're reminded of the tension between the two. The tension is a big part of the theme of the epic, I want to say. So in the founding of the greatness that is Rome, there's nobility and pietas. However, there's also something that has to be sacrificed, and that's personal attachments, and that's part of the burden or the molus that is Rome. So the first speech, as I said, is to himself, and he says he would have preferred to have died in Troy, as did the others before their father's eyes. So in Latin, that's ante ora patrum, so before the, literally, I guess, before the face of the father. And this is part of a recurrent phrasing. More often it's phrased as ante ora parentum, so before the faces of the parents. So he would have preferred to have died before the faces of the parents, just as these other heroes had died, these other Trojan heroes. And why I think it's echoed so often, why this phrasing and this as a horrible way to die and a horrible fate is it signifies, let's say, the threat in the poem to the future. So if children die before the parents' eyes there, or before the parents' faces, it's an example where the parents see that their hopes for the future, their hopes for their offspring are dashed, right? And it's something that, is you're not expecting as a parent. It's probably the most horrific thing you can imagine as a parent. And in specifically with respect to Aeneas, it signifies, if he's thinking about, let's say, the death of his own son Ascanius, or Iulus, the other name for Ascanius, the destiny of Rome, the future of the Trojans, and then the Trojan/Roman race, and his own family legacy and continuity. So this is the first speech, okay? So remember the storms happening, sent by Juno, all looks lost. It thunders from the pole and the ether, this is the narrator, and the ether flashes thick fire, and all things threaten immediate death to men. Instantly, Aeneas groans, his limbs slack with cold, stretching his two hands towards the heaven. He cries out in this voice, "Oh, 3-4 times fortunate were those who chanced to die in front of their father's eyes, under Troy's high walls. Oh, Diomedes, son of Tydeus, bravest of Greeks, why could I not have fallen at your hand in the fields of Ilium and poured out my spirit, where fierce Hector lies beneath Achilles' spear, and mighty Sarpedon, where Simois rolls and sweeps away so many shields, helmets, brave bodies of men in its waves? So why couldn't I have died on the sands of the beaches in Troy, or washed away by the straits of Simois there, and I would have been spared this horrific storm here now, and this fate of dying, let's say, alone, with all hope lost. And contrast that with his second speech. So that was alone, and that was to himself. This is his second speech. The commander's words, again, the narrator setting them up. The commander's words relieve their stricken hearts. My comrades, hardly strangers to pain before now, we all have weathered worse. Some God will grant us an end to this as well. You've threaded the rocks resounding with Scylla's howling rabid dogs, and taken the brunt of the Cyclops' boulders too. Call up your courage again, dismiss your grief and fear. A joy it will be one day, perhaps, to remember even this. Through so many hard straits, so many twists and turns, our course holds firm for Latium. There fate holds out, a homeland calm at peace. There the gods decree, the kingdom of Troy will rise again. Bear up, save your strength for better times to come. So a couple of things to note in this speech, which I think is a good one, let's say, in terms of the rhetoric of leadership. So let's think about, again, this in terms of the theme of the course, war and literature, and how one of the themes we were thinking about is leadership, and how literature presents warrior leaders. And Agamemnon, we saw, didn't turn out to be such a great warrior leader. He didn't really read his men very well. He lost touch with them. He lost touch with himself. He lost touch with himself in terms of a prideful arrogance and prideful kind of greed over titles and conquest, and mistakenly gave speeches at the wrong time that did not suit the men. So thinking at one time that if he said, let's go back to Greece, that would have a reverse psychological effect and would rouse them. But in fact, it had the opposite. They were, yeah, let's do that. And ended up giving that order 3 times. And as I said, it was only because of Diomedes and Odysseus stepping in the other 2 times that we even have a story of the Iliad at all. Think of that as in contrast with Aeneas here. So Aeneas knows what his men need to hear. They're desperate. And as the narrator points out, the commander, Aeneas's words, relieve their stricken hearts. So their hearts are in despair. They think all is lost and they're not sure if they can continue. And these words bring them back and rouse them. I also want you to keep this in mind, let us say, and there's a couple of famous speeches from Henry V, Shakespeare's Henry V, that we'll be reading in a couple weeks, okay? So there too, think about the types of appeal that the good military leader makes to the souls of the people under his or her command. So that in Henry V, we'll see similar appeals to how this will soon be over, and we will look back, and we'll think this nothing. Similar appeals to our cause is divinely ordained and just, okay? And that the gods will see to a positive end for it, okay? So senses of divine providence in a Christian context for Henry V here in this kind of context of the Roman gods, the sense that the gods will be guiding them to a positive end, as well as the sense of their ability in the future to look back at this as a heroic time. Both of those kind of arguments, those rhetorical flourishes are at play in both those speeches. So right after that second speech, Aeneas had been saying these words about, yeah, don't worry, nothing to worry about. And then we go back to the narrator, and the narrator kind of undercuts all of those. And we see these as, let's say, merely the rhetoric of the leader, maybe merely some nice glossing of almost a political speech, so to speak, to convince the masses, to convince the troops. And the narrator comments, brave words, sick with mounting cares. He assumes a look of hope and keeps his anguish buried in his heart. Okay, so I guess there's a couple ways to look at that. This, it's kind of could be seen as the again, merely rhetoric, a rhetorical ploy used to manipulate the men, and a kind of deceitful language. But also, I think on the other hand, and probably more prevalently, we see that as a kind of a heroic swallowing of one's own private fears and one's own concerns in order for the betterment of the whole, in order to bring up and make better those around them. And remember, that's kind of one of the functions of leadership, so. And when I have the unfortunate lot in life to work in an organization, large organization, the government, where you're always on these leadership courses, right? So not always, but you're sometimes sent on these leadership courses, and so there's a lot of ink is spilt in the kind of the circles around leadership and management and administration studies around the difference between management and leadership. Okay, so anyone can manage, and organize and direct a project or people, but I guess the thinking is that in leadership you're doing something different. So in being a leader, what are you doing? So I would say what we see in the literature is is that the leaders, the great leaders we see in the great stories, are ones that make the people around them better, and it's kind of like what you see around, in the NFL, or Super Bowl was last night, that when they talk about great leaders in sports, they say, oh, he makes everybody on his team better, or she makes everyone on her team better. And that's one of the things they say in sport. I think that's one of the things that work in terms of, say, organizational dynamics, but it's also what we see in literature in terms of the warrior leaders. How do they operate as leaders, as good leaders? In both the case of Henry V and Aeneas, they bring out the best in their troops. They don't play on their fears. They try to get them to overcome their fears. So Agamemnon was playing on their fears and thought that he could win that way. But here Aeneas and Henry V, as we'll see, allow them to be better than what they would otherwise be, allow them to be the best selves that they can be, allow them to overcome fear, allow them to be directed toward a goal that is higher than themselves, and to see themselves in that goal as opposed to their own petty individual concerns. And if someone's able to strive for something that's larger than themselves, the communal effort, there's a lot of meaning that they've given to their lives, And I think that's part of the, let's say, the lesson of the Aeneid itself, around, let's say, not only just warrior leadership, but also what is the greatness of Rome and what is the greatness of Aeneas's destiny, is that it's about something bigger than an individual, and it allows individuals to see themselves in a higher community and a higher destiny. So the narrator undercuts these words undercuts those words, as I said, by showing how Aeneas's second speech is concealing, let's say, the anguish buried in his heart. And I wanted to point out here that's very similar to line from Milton's Paradise Lost, and I've probably mentioned it a couple of times, but do read the Aeneid if you haven't read it, and try to find time to read it all. And that's just the excerpts I asked you to read. But also, when you find time, when you're not, maybe in a summer at some point between your busy course loads, put Paradise Lost on your list, and maybe find some sort of summary or what have you, that with analysis that helps you get through it, but and helps you to see the beauty of it. Anyway, in that great work, Satan, again, book one, right off the bat, we have Satan, who's trying to rally his men. In this case, it's the fallen angels who are wallowing in this lake, this burning lake in hell. And there's thousands and thousands of these doomed fallen angels who just lost in this battle of heaven. And he gives a brave and rousing speech to bring, you could say, in some way, I hadn't really thought of this before, but is Satan an example of the kind of the leader that I was just describing? I would say ultimately, I would say no, because it ultimately comes back on himself about how great he is. It's not about building up others. But Satan gives a rousing speech trying to tell them to get out of the burning lake and let's get going. We've got a lot of work to do. And the narrator comes afterwards and says, vaunting aloud, but racked with deep despair, to again, very similar to this narrative undercutting of the brave words of the leader. I think they're more sinister in the Miltonic example than they are for the Aeneid, but interesting comparison nonetheless. So he's roused the troops. He's had a vision from his mother, Venus, who lets him know that the other ships are safe. They've only lost one, and she's instructed him to go see the queen of Carthage, Dido, and that she will help him. So he heads over to the city to check it out, and he sees a temple to Juno in Carthage and sees depictions of the Trojan War on it. And he's heartened as this shows that the fame of his people is known even there. And again, the narrator seems to undercut the words with this narrative description. So Aeneas says, feeding his spirit on empty, lifeless pictures. So we'll get to what Aeneas had said. He had described these pictures and how great it was to see the fame of the Trojans there. But the narrator undercuts that as somehow hollow. If your only, let's say, permanence is in these lifeless pictures, then that's not much, apparently. If it's just lifeless pictures, then you need more in terms of being, let's say, a higher accomplishment that transcends, let's say, an individual lifetime. So here's the description of that scene. Begin with the narrator. Here in the grove, something new appeared that calmed his fears. For the first time, Aeneas dared to hope for safety and to put greater trust in his afflicted fortunes. While waiting for the queen in the vast temple, he looks at each thing, while he marvels at the city's wealth, the skill of their artistry, and the products of their labors. He sees the battles at Troy in their correct order. I'm just going to pause there. So the Aeneid is one of these books where the more you read it, every line resonates and reveals something new to you every time. And even this, reveals, as I reread it, reveals new things to me every time that maybe I didn't point out the first time to you. But when we look at we're going to talk about book 6 in the next lectures, so Wednesday's lecture. So book 6 is the descent into the underworld. He sees his father, who had passed away previously, sees the ghost of his father, and the ghost of his father tells him about the future of Rome and these descendants that will be great leaders of the Roman Republic. And he also has this kind of programmatic statement on the mission of Rome. So he says something to the effect of, I won't get the quote right, but other peoples, other nations will be better at spinning bronze and carving bronze statues that breathe life, etc. And others will be better at charting the stars, etc. But Rome, your great skill is to rule others with power and to conquer the proud and spare the vanquished. So keep that in mind. First of all, for the meaning of the epic as a whole, we'll talk about those lines in Wednesday's lecture. But here's an example, let's say, of a people that maybe are better than the Romans at bronze sculpture, for instance, but the narrator has reminded us these are just merely, lifeless pictures. So if that's what you've done as a culture is you've produced fine art, but you haven't instituted laws that rule peace and order people living together, spared the vanquished and conquered the proud. If you haven't done that, then in some ways those accomplishments are hollow. And it's a way, it's for Virgil saying how the Roman achievement is greater than the Greeks. So I was saying, back to this quote, we're around here. He said, while he marvels at the city's wealth, the skill of their artistry, that's what reminded me of that passage, and the products of their labor, he sees the battles at Troy in their correct order, the war known through its fame to the whole world, the sons of Atreus, of Priam and Achilles angered with both. He halted and said with tears, so this is Aeneas speaking, what place is there, Achates? What region of earth not full of our hardships? See Priam. Here too virtue has its rewards. Here too there are tears for events, and mortal things touch the heart. Lose your fears, this fame will bring you benefit. So he's saying, so everywhere our hardships have touched hearts everywhere, and here too they see, they understand, hardships and pain and suffering, and because they value these things, they will have pity on us and they will help us. Okay. So finally, the first book introduces us to Dido, the Carthaginian queen. Dido is gracious and helpful. She's well disposed to Aeneas. And Dido's passion for Aeneas is caused by direct intervention of Venus, who sends Cupid in disguise as Ascanius, that's disguised as Aeneas's son, to force Dido to fall in love with Aeneas. So Venus wants to do all of this to ensure that Dido provides assistance to Aeneas, okay? And I'm referring you to some lines in case you missed them. We won't read them, but just refer to those lines 7:12 to 22 in terms of unhappy Dido who has fallen deeply in love with Aeneas, and it'll ultimately lead to her demise. In the next lecture, we'll talk a great deal about this tragedy of Dido and what's going on there in the epic. What does it mean? And are we to sympathize with Dido and her fate, and what are we to make of the love affair, and should Aeneas have left, and was he too cold in leaving in his response to Dido? So these are all questions that have plagued interpretations of book 4 later. So in book 1, all we see is them meeting. In books 2 and 3, Aeneas recounts his adventures to Dido, and Dido is just listening and falling in love with Aeneas. And then in book 4, it depicts their actual love affair, and they're sparking up this love affair, and she seems to consider it a marriage of some sort. And he is reminded by the god Mercury, who's sent by Jupiter. So, Aeneas, you got to get going here. I know you're having fun and all these things, but you've got to go found a new people here on the Italian shores. So let's get a move on. So he's about to go, and that sparks this tension with Dido, who in sorrow kills herself and curses, before killing herself, curses the Roman people and hopes for this eternal enmity between the Carthaginians and the Romans. So in a way, she's cursing the Romans, but also cursing the Carthaginians, because they're gonna be, head to head with the Romans, and it's not going to work out well for Carthage. So that's book 1. That's what we see happen in book 1. And we'll turn now to book 2. And book 2 is this incredible depiction of the fall of Troy. And I really urge you to read. If you read nothing else, I think you'll get a lot out of book 2, in the sense that, we've talked about the Iliad and how that shows everything up to the death of Hector. And then this is the great depiction that we have of the events afterwards. It's the great depiction of the events of the Trojan horse, and then of what happens when the Greeks take over Troy. So in book 2, so I think for that reason it might be interesting for you, but also just because of the haunting scenes. They're very memorable scenes that are portrayed there, and I'll try to give you a sense of them here. But like I said, I think it warrants reading yourself. And haunting scenes that will, I'm sure, live with you after you've read them. So in book 2, Aeneas provides his first-person account of the Trojan horse and the sack of Troy, and this, along with book 3, are direct parallels to in the Odyssey, the Homeric epic we didn't read, books 9 to 12, where Odysseus recounts or narrates his previous adventures to the Phaeacians. So they're parallels. They're narrated in parallel circumstances. So each is in the court of a monarch who will offer assistance. So the Phaeacians, Alcinous is the king there, and he's offering assistance to Odysseus and eventually helps him get back to Ithaca. And in each court, there's an implicit offer of marriage to the hero, which would cause them to stay and not achieve their final return to home, or in the case of Aeneas, their new home. So this implicit offer of marriage has to be, let's say, denied. And in both, the hero's visit has a disastrous consequence for the host. So in the case of the Phaeacians, Poseidon, after he hears that the Phaeacians helped, so Poseidon is the god that hates Odysseus and and is preventing him from returning home, and he finds out that the Phaeacians aided him to return to Ithaca, and he wipes out their island vengefully. And obviously the consequences for Dido and the Carthaginians we've talked about. So she kills herself. She's in incredible sorrow, curses the Romans and Carthaginians, and by proclaiming an eternal enmity between the two peoples. So on the right, we have an artistic depiction of Odysseus at the court of Alcinous, and the content of the two stories corresponds in a lot of ways. They both begin with Troy and end how they arrived in that court, and include a lot of Aeneas's wanderings in book 3. So we're not going to talk about that too much, but the wanderings that he describes in book 3, often he follows the same path of Odysseus with minor changes, right? Like he goes, sees the Cyclops, but he's not mean to the Cyclops. So in each case, he follows Odysseus, but rewrites Odysseus and becomes, let's say, a better Odysseus, becomes a better hero, a newer and better version of the hero. Odysseus's narrative so focuses on his own cleverness and skill in avoiding death, and Aeneas's focuses on the sorrows he's endured and the necessity imposed on him by fate. So he begins his narrative with, "Sorrow, unspeakable sorrow, my queen, you asked me to bring to life once more." So that's how he starts his narrative, whereas Odysseus's narrative is almost a triumphant. Oh yeah, well, yeah, that's a great story. You know, we did this, and boy, and now I was so smart, I got out of this, and then we did that, and you know, us and me and the men, we were so heroic. You know, so quite a different tone and to the two stories. Odysseus' story begins after the fall of Troy, whereas Aeneas spends basically half of his story, all of book 2, on describing the sack of Troy. So obviously for a Trojan perspective, there's more grist to describe there, and as opposed to the exploits of the journey. So the Trojan horse. So we've all probably heard of this, at least to some extent, what this Trojan horse is. We've heard about this story. So the Greeks build this wooden horse, and they fill it with their best warriors, and they then sail to this island Tenedos that's just off the mainland of what is now Turkey, near Troy, right? And to hide their ships behind this island, and the Trojans assume that the Greeks have left for home, but they're unsure what to do with this horse. And they're struggling, they're arguing with one another. And this arguing, I would say, would remind the Virgilian reader of the civil strife that is the background of the Aeneid. So the 100 years of civil war. So we have the line in the Aeneid, "The common people are split into warring factions," I think is echoing this civil war in the background of the Aeneid. And then Laocoon, in case you're wondering how to pronounce that person's name, that's how I've heard it pronounced by people smarter than me, is a priest of Neptune, and he advises against accepting the horse, famously saying, "I fear the Greeks even when bearing gifts." Okay. The shepherds then bring in a Greek captive, Sinon, as they discuss these issues. So if they had listened to Laocoon, they wouldn't have brought the horse in, and it would be a different story altogether, right? They then bring in this captive. They find the shepherds have found this Greek person named Sinon, and they bring him in, and this is just in the midst of this discussion, and this is what sways them. So Sinon is telling a lying story. Sinon is a plant by the Greeks just to fool the Trojans, right? So according to Sinon, the Greeks received an oracle from Apollo demanding a human sacrifice. Now Ulysses, so that's the Roman name for Odysseus. Ulysses hates Sinon, so he was chosen as the victim, right? Simon said, okay, forget that, and he escaped and ran away. They couldn't find him. He's hiding in some bush, I guess. And then the Greeks took off without him, and then he was found by these Trojan shepherds. So Sinon then says the Greeks left to garner the favor of the gods and get reinforcements. And the horse that he says is an offering to Athena, or Minerva is the Roman name, to compensate her for the Greeks' theft of a statue during a raid of the city. So Sinon provides a plausible, let's say, story for why the Greeks left this horse there as a votive offering to Minerva. So the Trojans believe Sinon. And why? Because, well, maybe because they're honest and they pity him, okay? And they're compassionate. And their downfall, if we think about it, is caused by these good qualities. So they want to. So first, there's a couple of things going on. The Romans are countering, let's say, a Greek approach. They're distinguishing themselves from the Greeks, which is based on deception and lying from themselves, who, like the Trojans, could fall for that only because they're compassionate and honest people, okay? So that's one thing. The other thing would be that it's a warning perhaps against misplaced compassion, and it's a warning to sometimes be ruthless with an enemy. Okay, so maybe something to keep in mind when we think about the final scene with Aeneas and Turnus. So remember, we're not reading it. We're not going to closely analyze the lines, but we know the basic story, and it looms over the end of the story of what this last scene of him killing Turnus. So maybe the fate of the Trojans, misplaced compassion, can lead to your downfall. So just because you have someone like Turnus who's pleading to you at the end, maybe don't let them off the hook as the Trojans let the Greeks off the hook here. The Trojans are further motivated to believe Sinon because of the fate of Laocoon. So there's a famous sculpture here that resides in Vatican City of Laocoon and his sons, okay, being wrapped up by the serpent. So he's killed by these two. He's killed with his two sons by snakes that swim out of the sea and crush him. Okay, so this they were sent by the gods because the fate of Troy had to be sealed, right? Troy has to fall for the fate, and Laocoon's almost convincing the Trojans not to let this horse in, and the gods say, no, the fate's, this is Troy's got to fall. So they made sure that Laocoon's dispensed with, and so this fate leads them to believe that Laocoon was speaking improperly, even though he's actually speaking the truth, and leads them to think that they should take the horse in. So what we see there is kind of again this double motivation. So there's the motivation of fate and, let's say, intervention with the gods, but also human action. So they were there's a fate that drives what happens to Troy, but also human-willed action that seems to drive them in the same direction. So one of the lines really underscores this in Book 2. If fate and our own wits had not gone against us, surely Laocoon would have driven us on. So the Trojans break a hole in their walls so that they can wheel the giant horse into the city, thereby claiming the benefits from Minerva. And at night, of course, the Greeks come out of the horse and let their comrades who've sailed back from Tenedos into the city, and the sack of Troy has begun. At this point, the ghost of Hector appears to Aeneas in a dream and tells him that Troy's end has come, and Hector tells Aeneas to flee and to take his family and the household gods. They're called the Penates. So these household gods, these figures that were worshipped as part of family religious ritual, the household gods of Troy, and get out of there so that they can be preserved, that his family and the household gods can be preserved. Aeneas climbs to a rooftop from which he's able to survey the destruction, and he grabs his weapons and runs out to the street to fight. And the point seems to be here that in this depiction of him trying to fight, that there is a time for martial bravery, but in certain circumstances, it can be irrational. So in this case, the fight is completely lost, and it's irrational to fight back. And the words of Hector guiding him to get out of there with his family are let's say, it would be the rational course of action. So these lines here again from book 2. The Stygian straits shimmering back the blaze, the shouting of fighters soars, the clashing blare of trumpets. Out of my wits, I seize my arms. What reason for arms? So remember, this is Aeneas narrating the story. So the narrator at this point, it's a narration within the narration. So the I in this case is Aeneas. Just my spirit burning to muster troops for battle. Rush with comrades up to the city's heights. Fury and rage driving me breakneck on as it races through my mind. What a noble thing it is to die in arms. So this is an irrational thing going through his mind at this point, that it's a noble thing to die in arms. Sometimes maybe it is, according to this point of departure, but at this point it's underscored that very, martial sentiment. What's being underscored here is that it was irrational at this point, that thinking, being driven by this notion that it's noble to die in arms, didn't make sense. Why? Because he had a duty to the future. He had a duty to his family. He had to protect his family. He had to get them out of there. He had to protect a future line that had a destiny to found Rome. And for all these reasons, in a way, it was irresponsible. And often it would, it could be portrayed as a heroic thing in a Hollywood movie to go out there guns blazing against impossible odds, but it would, in a kind of a more sober analysis, it could be seen as irrational. So the narrator, this time Aeneas himself, undercuts the speech of Aeneas. Like, he's saying what he said to himself, and as he was trying to rally the Trojans, these other Trojans with him to fight the Greeks. Now, like a wolf pack out for blood on a foggy night, driven blindly on by relentless rabid hunger, leaving cubs behind, waiting, jaws parched. So, like a wolf pack that are so ravenous and maybe rabid, insane with blood thirstiness, they go out and they leave their cubs unattended. So too, he's going out on this kind of wild martial quest with other Trojans who he's rallied to try to fight the Greeks, when really he should be tending to the cubs, let's say the family. So he describes several horrifying scenes. He has an encounter with Helen, and then Venus comes to see him. So let's talk about some of the horrifying scenes, and we'll look a bit more closely at one of them. So I've just put a couple of the line numbers there for the Cassandra. He sees Cassandra being dragged away from a nervous temple in chains. And so what we know there from the stories around the fall of Troy is that she's being dragged out of the temple after she's just been raped, and she's being dragged into slavery for a miserable life. And then she's going to be killed when she returns at the hands of Clytemnestra. Okay, so we know Cassandra's fate, and it's not a good one. Like, she's suffering the worst, horrible fate right now. He sees the Greeks storming the royal palace, where Priam puts on his armor, and Hecuba begs him to take refuge at the household altar, and we'll look at that a bit. And he sees the murder of Priam's young son Polites, again before the parents' eyes, and he sees the murder of Priam himself. Okay. So if we turn to one thing I'll note. So we'll turn to the description of the death of Priam, and the description of the death of Priam echoes, because he's putting the sword hilt deep into Priam. This is Achilles' son, actually. Pyrrhus does this, kills Priam. It's put hilt deep into Priam, and it echoes the death of Turnus. So Aeneas, at the end of the epic, Aeneas puts his sword hilt deep into Turnus as well. So I'm going to call up the actual text so we can look at that and go through this. So this is the depiction of Priam, the death of Priam, and the lead up to that. And maybe you ask, so remember, this is Aeneas describing this to the court of Dido, and others are listening. Maybe you ask, what was Priam's fate? When he saw the end of the captive city, the palace doors wrenched away, and the enemy among the inner rooms, the aged man clasped his long neglected armor on his old trembling shoulders and fastened on his useless sword, and hurried into the thick of the enemy seeking death. In the center of the halls and under the sky's naked arch was a large altar with an ancient laurel nearby that leant on the altar and clothed the household gods with shade. Here Hecuba and her daughters, like doves driven by a dark storm, crouched uselessly by the shrines. Okay, so there's all these, Priam's grabbing arms, but his sword is useless. Hecuba is trying to hide by an altar, hoping to seek their refuge, that no one will kill anyone, no one would commit the sacrilege to kill someone else at an altar. And this is all useless because of the bloodthirstiness of the Greeks here. They're killing regardless of whether someone's in a sanctuary, a religious sanctuary, by an altar. It doesn't matter. All of this is being neglected by this incredible, unspeakable destruction of Troy here. And when she saw Priam himself dressed in youthful armor, she cried, "What mad thought, poor husband, urges you to fasten on these weapons? Where do you run? The hour demands no such help, nor defenses such as these. Not if my own Hector were here himself. Here, I beg you, this altar will protect us all, or we'll die together." So this is Hecuba. This is Hector's mother and wife of Priam, and she's pleading with Priam to seek shelter at the altar, along with her and the daughters. And Hecuba, for those of you who've read Shakespeare's Hamlet, in the second act, he's talking about a play where the lines are from Hecuba, and it's about this scene. It's about the scene. It's a play built on this scene, fallen Troy, the death of Priam and Hecuba at this altar, and the death of Priam at this altar, and Hamlet reacts, to this actor who's able to garner tears at these lines of Hecuba's, and says, "Who's Hecuba to he, or he to Hecuba?" So those famous lines of Hamlet are referring to this scene. So she spoke and drew the old man toward her. So we're right here now, and set him down on the sacred steps. See Polites, one of Priam's sons, escaping Pyrrhus's slaughter. So Polites, one of Priam's son, is running away from Pyrrhus, who's Achilles' son. Okay, runs down the long hallways through enemies and spears, and wounded crosses the empty courts. Pyrrhus chases after him, eager to strike him, and grasps at him now with his hand at spear point. When finally he reached the eyes and gaze of his parents, he fell and poured out his life in a river of blood. Priam, though even now in death's clutches, did not spare his voice at this, or hold back his anger. So this is Priam speaking. "If there is any justice in heaven that cares about such things, may the gods repay you with fit thanks and due reward for your wickedness. For such acts you have made me see my own son's death in front of my face, and defiled a father's sight with murder. Yet Achilles, whose son you falsely claim to be, was no such enemy to Priam. He respected the suppliant's rights and honor and returned Hector's bloodless corpse to its sepulchre and sent me home to my kingdom. So he's referring to book 24 of the Iliad that we read there, right? So he's referring to no matter what Achilles did, he was not as bent on rage as this supposed son of Achilles, Pyrrhus. He respected a suppliant's right and returned Hector's body. He did not disrespect him in such a way. So the old man spoke, and through his ineffectual spear, again so useless, without strength, which immediately spun from the clanging bronze and hung uselessly from the center of the shield's boss. Pyrrhus spoke to him. Then you can be messenger, carry the news to my father, to Peleus's son. Remember to tell him of degenerate Pyrrhus and of my sad actions. Now die. Saying this, he dragged him, trembling and slithering in the pool of his son's blood to the very altar, and twined his left hand in his hair, raised the glittering sword in his right, and buried it to the hilt in his side. This was the end of Priam's life. This was the death that fell to him by lot. Seeing Troy ablaze and its citadel toppled, he who was once the magnificent ruler of so many Asian lands and peoples, a once mighty body lies on the shore, the head shorn from its shoulders, a corpse without a name. So again, haunting stuff there from book 2, and again, I think our takeaway from book 2 is about the horror of a couple of things. If we think about the theme of the course, so the horrors of siege warfare. So let's think about the horrors of siege warfare. So with what we see in the literature as well as the history is that there's no kind of form of warfare that ends up being more brutal to innocent lives of family members of the eventually captured city, and this was well known in ancient times. It's well known in modern times, and we'll see. Let's say it's something we need to keep in mind in terms of Henry V's. When we get to Henry V's positive or mercy to Harfleur. Okay, he's been sieging Harfleur. He threatens them with a lot of violent action that we'll have to look at that speech. But then when he finally takes it over, is merciful to them. So there's the question of siege warfare. There's also this question of the reminders throughout the epic that this is the fate of Carthage at the hands of the Romans. So as you're listening to this, you're Virgil's audience, and you're a great Roman, and you're thinking, oh, those Greeks who did this to the Trojans, who were our forefathers and mothers, and well, we got them back. Aeneas settled in Italy, founded a new people, founded us. Now we rule the Greeks, and all has come full circle. So there's celebratory come-upmanship there, but there's also the echo that we Romans have also done this to Carthaginians. There's reminders that, and we'll see at the end of book 4, kind of direct allusions to that this episode has led to the burning walls of Carthage, and that they too will suffer the same fate as these Trojans who we so sympathize with, and at whose hands? At our hands, us supposedly noble Romans. He then sees Helen and considers killing her. He's stopped by his mother Venus. She reminds him that his family's in danger. And she says, Helen and Paris are not to blame. It's the gods are responsible. She tears away the clouds that normally blind mortal sight or human sight to what's really going on. And she by tearing away these clouds, this veil, he can see that there are gods tearing at the walls. So Neptune is there with his trident on the walls and breaking down the walls of Troy. And he sees, it emphasizes a couple things. Well, first of all, it emphasizes that to some extent, human agency is less important than we might think. It also emphasizes the inevitability of Troy, and it's a reminder to him that he's not going to be able to fight this. He's got to take care of what he can control, so to speak. He can try to protect his family. He can try to ensure his destiny of starting a new people in a new land. I have a note here too that in a way you could think about this act of tearing away the clouds as what the function of the poet's work, right? So in both Homer and Virgil, that's in a way what they're doing is someone might see that story, like any story, story of any war, the story of any battle, or the story of any love affair, whatever the story is, as just on the human level, and might just see it on the material level, and might just see it as actions of earthly beings in conflict and maybe reconciling. And what the poet's trying to do is showing other higher forces at work, how it's tied to the larger movement of the cosmos, the gods, fate, how it's part of a larger whole. And this is kind of, as I said, symbolized, or almost kind of, we have a glimpse of that kind of functioning of the poet's work when Venus shows what's going on with the fall of Troy. Now Aeneas, book 2 is closing now, and he finds his family and leaves the city. He takes his father Anchises on his shoulders. He says, "My hands are bloody from fighting, so you, Father, hold the household gods. So I can't, I've been befouled, so to speak. I need to cleanse myself and purify myself before I can touch these household gods. So you hold them. I'll hold you on my shoulders, and we'll go." And his Ascanius is right by his side, and Creusa, his wife, follows at a distance behind. Now, one question is sometimes posed by people is, why did he let Creusa kind of trail behind and not look back maybe a bit more often, because Creusa ends up dying, right? Now, one reason, I guess the simplest reason, is Creusa has to die for the rest of the story to unfold. Like the Creusa has to die in order for him to be able to start a new race of Trojans combined with Latins in Italy that will form the Roman race. Okay, so he has to marry Lavinia in Italy and found this new race. Now, so that's kind of let's say, a simple reason of story mechanics. I guess the other, let's say, in terms of the level of symbol, is Creusa represents to some extent that aspect of the past that can't be taken with you. So try to remember this epic, more so than the Iliad, is an epic of tradition, of time, and of the history of a people, and how the history of the people has to preserve the past, but some things have to be left behind. Now, so there's a certain element of Rome that's born in Troy and the fall of Troy, but parts of Troy have to be left behind, and Creusa represents a certain aspect of the past that has to be left behind, let's say. Anchises is the past that's carried on our backs, let's say, that we bring with us. Anchises kind of represents that. And he's also leading the future. He's leading Ascanius, his son, who's representing kind of future generations. So there's the past that he can burden and shoulder. There's the future that he can lead and try to found. But there's certain things that he's going to have to leave behind. And there's certain risks in that future, right? So there's the risk of Ascanius dying before his parents' face, before his parents' eyes, as so often happens. So he's got to kind of shield against that risk. So it's a famous scene that here's one example of a work of art that's tried to portray that scene. And we saw in the last slide on the right was another, I'll just go back there, another amphora of that, ancient amphora of that. And there's been countless representations in art and statues and in references in literary work. So it's in one image, it summarizes to a great extent who Aeneas is. It summarizes Aeneas as man of duty, of piety. It summarizes Aeneas as selflessly looking to the duties to family, to the community represented by the destiny of Rome that he's leading in the future of his child, Ascanius, and the gods. He's ensuring that his father's carrying those household gods. So he has duties to his family, duty to his community, duty to the gods that he carries and burdens on his shoulders. Okay, so with that, I'd like to close. And a reminder again of our assignment due this Friday. And for the Wednesday lecture, a reminder that will be our final lecture on Virgil's Aeneid before we go on a reading break. And remember, it's a reading break. It's not a spring break. I don't know what you do there and that kind of stuff. You got to catch up on your reading if you can. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'll see you at the next lecture.